No, I haven't. It's on there.
There should be in front of you. If somebody's missing a hand, I'll let them know.
Okay. Normally when I talk about free will and neuroscience, I like to start with my motivation for writing on the topic. I've been doing this for a very long time now, 15 years maybe. And the motivation partly comes from my worries about the effect that the news that people have no free will has on their behavior. This comes out a lot in, well, online, in magazines, and so on. And I won't do the long version of this. We now have social psych studies that show that if you give evidence anyway, that if you lower people's confidence in free will, you increase misbehavior. And I don't advocate censorship, but I think nobody has shown that there's no free will. And because the news looks like it's somewhat harmful, at least, I like to keep at it, among other things. It's not my only topic. So all I'm going to read in this connection now is an email I got out of the blue from somebody when I was writing my book, Effective Intentions, which was published in 2009. And she wrote, "Dear Dr. Mele, I recently purchased a DVD by Dr. Stephen Walensky. He explains from the point of view of neuroscience that there is no such thing as free will, as we can only perceive an action after it has already occurred. Can you please help me with this? I can understand that I don't know what thought will occur next, but that has already happened is beyond comprehension. Thank you, as I am in a lot of despair." And I thought, well, sad and funny at the same time. I actually emailed her back. I told her I was writing this book. I said, don't worry about it. I've shown they haven't shown it. You can be comfortable and happy. And then I decided to end that book with the title of a song, and the title was Don't Worry, Be Happy. It's a great little song. Now, the next thing I usually do is go through all the experimental designs and data and so on, and I don't have time for that. There are 2 points I want to concentrate on. A certain issue about generalization, and then a certain issue about souls. And that's not because I'm a soul guy. I'll tell you that now. So you can think of a standard, sort of simple version of an argument for no free will that goes like this. In Libet-style studies, subjects decide unconsciously. If they decide unconsciously, they decide unfreely. That would be the second premise. But we can generalize his findings to all cases of decision. So all decisions are made unconsciously. So all decisions are made unfreely. And then at least you have no freedom with regard to your decisions, if that argument goes through. And then if you have, well, any action that executes a decision inherits unfreedom from the unfreedom of the decision, you're off and running. And what I have tried to do in the past is to show that there's no good evidence that decisions are made prior to W time. You've heard a lot about W time. And that would be important because if they're made at W time, then we don't have good reason to believe that they're made unconsciously. I have argued that there's no good reason to believe that the point of no return is hit before W time, and actually we saw evidence for that today, and there was older evidence too. And then I get on to the generalization point. So I think I'll go there now. Oh, my plan is to finish in less than 20 minutes. We'll see how it goes. So look at 2, generalizing, and there's a quotation just under it. Our overall findings do suggest some fundamental characteristics of the simpler acts that may be applicable to all consciously intended acts and even to responsibility and free will. So here you do get the idea that you can generalize from the findings in these cases to all cases of decision. Now, oh yeah, there's a little technical thing on the handout. So proximal decisions, as a term, are decisions you make now to do a thing now. So that's what the proximal is about. It's about now. Like Libet, I think of deciding as a momentary action of intention formation. So if you were to deliberate and then decide, I wouldn't call that whole process deciding. I reserve deciding for the bit at the end, where you settle on, this or that. But we also make snap decisions where there is no deliberation that leads to it. Now this isn't to say that the deciding happens at an instant, but there's no real measure of moments, and that's why I use momentary. So however long you think it might take to move from unsettledness to settledness, that's decided. Okay? I don't put a number on it. And I don't use instant, I use moment because it is sort of an open word, loose word. So even if all proximal decisions are made unconsciously in Libet's experiments and the Libet style experiments, would we be warranted in generalizing to all proximal decisions, or all decisions, proximal or otherwise? Now let's think a bit about the claim that decisions are made unconsciously. Here's a sentence. She decided unconsciously to flex her wrist now or press that button now. What does that mean? Well, all it means is that she decided and she wasn't aware at the time of deciding, or she wasn't aware at the time of the decision she made. That's all. It doesn't mean that consciousness was not involved in any process that issued in the decision. Now in these Libet experiments and Libet style experiments, there's really only one role for consciousness after you get going, and that is you need a conscious event to report. You need to report a W time. So what consciousness is doing there is working on the report. So you try to track the hand or spot on the clock, and you know you need to report the first moment in which you felt the intention or urge or whatever. And you're encouraged to be spontaneous, not think in advance about what to do. So what that tells you really is don't use consciousness in coming to your decision. Just use it for the reporting. Okay, Bjorn's asked you already heard about, so I don't have to do that. Restrictivism. Yeah, so here's a view in philosophy. It's, I don't know, I'm tempted to say it's a minority view, but it's a view anyway. I know, Peter is one restrictivist. But Peter, you know, is the good kind of restrictivist. And, but here's the idea that free will can be exercised only in cases in which there is some kind of competition between serious or important things. So C.A. Campbell is my favorite example of a restrictivist because he's very precise about it. And he says only in cases in which your moral judgment is contrary to what you're tempted to do, and only in those cases is free will even in play. Now, if you're a restrictivist like that, then you think these Libet-style studies have nothing to do with free will because they're not about being torn between morality and temptation. They're about arbitrary picking. Now, either restrictivism is true or it's false. If it's true, then the studies are not about free will. And if it's false, then they might be. And I myself am a really easygoing guy about free will. I haven't even taken a stand on whether compatibilism is true or false. So that means I'm really easygoing. And if I'm easygoing about that, I'm going to be easygoing about this. What I like to do is generate as many positive theories of free will as I can that make some kind of sense, and then just try to sell them to people. And depending on your preferences, you might go for one or another. And I think that's way better than having just one view. In fact, if you have many views, you get invited to many more conferences and talk to people like you better. There are good reasons to do it this way. Okay, but whether restrictivism is true or false, we at least can see that there's a difference between arbitrary picking, where no conscious thought goes into the decision that's made in the end, the difference in principle anyway, and the kinds of decisions we make when we're torn about really serious things, like, is it finally time to get the divorce? Or, that's a nice job offer, I have a good job, would it be wise at my age to move or should I stay? And we don't just toss a coin, and we don't just arbitrarily pick, we agonize over it. Okay? Now, in those cases, it seems to me, the work for consciousness certainly isn't to report on when I first became aware of my decision. Who cares? Right? My attention is focused on solving the problem. And in fact, if you were to ask me to report on when I first made my decision to reject a job offer or whatever, while I'm struggling with it and then make a decision, that'll probably really screw up my W time. I mean, you know, I'd really have to guess. So these two decisions, I think, kinds of decision, are so different that even if we thought that Libet and followers were right about the arbitrary picking, we couldn't make any warranted inference about the other ones. So that's the generalization point. Liad gave us evidence that the neural processes here are even different in the case of arbitrary picking and deliberate choosing. And of course, you know, there are lots of issues to think about, like whether they're there but you can't see them, etc. But anyway, the generalization is too huge a leap to just let go. Okay, so when I get to this point in discussions with my many friends, I sometimes hear the following thing. Well, even if I'm right about all that stuff, it really doesn't matter, because what the experiments show is that the brain drives behavior, and what free will requires is immaterial souls. Now, the first time I actually heard this was in 2009. It was Dan Wegner. I had put together this sort of mini-conference to generate a big Templeton grant, and Dan was there, I don't know, it was about a dozen people. And so as we chatted, because people are cautious when they talk to audiences, but you know, you drink a couple of beers, you're sitting aside, I'm a friendly guy. Dan said, you know what, these points of yours really don't matter because free will requires souls. Now, here's some quotations. I mean, Dan's not alone in this, and since then I've heard this from quite a few people. Here's one. This Montague quotation is my favorite one. Free will, he's a neurobiologist, read Montague. Free will is the idea that we make choices and have thoughts independent of anything remotely resembling the physical process. Free will is the close cousin to the idea of the soul, the concept that you, your thoughts and feelings derive from an entity that is separate and distinct from the physical mechanisms that make up your body. From this perspective, your choices are not caused by physical events, something Tim mentioned as a very minority view, but instead emerge wholly formed from somewhere indescribable and outside the purview of physical descriptions. This implies that free will cannot have evolved by natural selection. Come on. As that would place it directly in the stream of causally connected events. Frieden Cohen, a philosopher and a neuroscientist. Most people's view of the mind is implicitly dualist and libertarian, and by dualist they mean what we call substance dualist. So there's the physical and then there's the soul, the non-physical soul. Some people think there are souls but they're physical. I'm not worried about that. It's the non-physical that is worrying me. And of course I told Dan Wegner and I told Reed Montague and many other people, well, I don't think of free will like that. I don't think of it as requiring a soul. I'm a physicalist, a physical kind of guy. I believe in physical stuff. I don't really believe in non-physical souls. But then they said, well, you're a philosopher. You guys just make it up. And then I asked, but what makes you think you're right about what free will means? And usually they don't really quite know, but they'll say something. So I thought I would do some experimental philosophy, really opinion polls, as John Haynes said. In fact, I think I prompted him to do his because the first one I'm going to report I did early on. Let me just read you the stories. These are quick. I had the story I was interested in, and then I had a kind of control story. So here's story one. In 2019, scientists finally proved that everything in the universe is physical and that what we refer to as minds are actually brains at work. This one's not on the handout. I just wanted to keep the handout short. They also show exactly where decisions and intentions are found in the brain and how they are caused. Our decisions are brain processes and our intentions are brain states. Also, our decisions and intentions are caused by other brain processes. Okay, now, in the same year, John Jones saw a $20 bill fall from the pocket of the person walking in front of him. He considered returning it, but he decided to keep it. Of course, given what scientists later discovered, John's decision was a brain process, and it was caused by other brain processes. So, this is all physical, totally physical story. I asked people, did John have free will at the time? And 73% said yes. 5 minutes, I can do it. So 73% said yes. Now, there are some people who just don't believe in free will no matter what, right? But at least we're getting 73% going with me, and less than 27 going with my friends on the other side. And when I tell them that, then they start to worry a bit. Okay. Now, very recently we did a follow-up study, actually a huge study, and this is just a little piece of it. And I think this is on the handout. Yeah, it is. So we just simplified that. I'm not going to read you my control story, but if you want to hear it, I'll tell it to you later. It involves evil chemists and mind control. No neuroscientists are in that story at all.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So now here's story A. It's on the handout. Imagine that scientists finally discovered that there are no souls. So, for example, they discover that you don't have a soul, your friends and neighbors don't have souls, and so on. That's the whole thing. And then we ask three things. Do people have free will in this situation? Do they make conscious decisions? Are they morally responsible for their actions? And then in story B, we just add a little bit more to make it more concrete. Like everyone else, John doesn't have a soul. One day he sees a $20 bill fall out of the pocket of the person in front of him. He picks it up and keeps it for himself. And we ask about both stories, do people have free will? Or in John's case, did John have free will? It's 73% again, which is kind of magical. And 18% say no. Then you'll see the figures for conscious decisions and for moral responsibility. In stories in which something morally significant is happening, the moral responsibility ratings are usually exactly the same or very close to it as the free will ratings. If you switch to events that have no moral actions, that have no moral significance, then you get changes. And then you'll notice that in the more concrete story, we have 90% of people saying the person has free will. These are not hand-selected people, right? This was MTurk, this study. And then similar figures for conscious decisions and moral responsibility. So to wrap it up, before we claim that we have data that show that there's no free will, we need to ask ourselves, how would we need to conceive of free will in order for that claim to be true or promising? And then once we think about that, how we would need to conceive of free will to make it work, we need to think about whether that notion of free will we have is legitimate or useful. And I did it in less than 20, right? All right, that's it.